tens of thousands of people around the country and facilitating conversations around economic, racial, and gender justice. And really, it's a pleasure to be joining you all today. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us in this conversation. Thanks a lot to Jasmine, to you for the invitation, to Free the People and Move to Amend for hosting this discussion, and to the other panelists. Really excited to hear from you all and learn with you all about how to do this work better. So thank you. Oh, and he, him pronouns.
Thank you. Wonderful. And Mason, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hey, everyone. My name is Mason Dunn. I use he, him, his, or they, them, theirs pronouns. I am the executive director of the Massachusetts Transgender Political Coalition, or MTPC, based in Boston, but working statewide across Massachusetts for trans rights and equality, which we do through political advocacy and activism, as well as community empowerment and education. Myself, I've been an educator for trans rights for about 13 years now. I'm also a lawyer, don't hold it against me. And I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation and to see where we end up today.
Thank you. Last but not least, George.
Hello, I'm George Friday. Hope you're doing well. I am a lifelong activist, starting about 12, like Raul, in a different way. And I live in North Carolina. I'm one of the founders of Move to Amend and on the board. Most of my work has been about building movements across race, class, gender, religion, all that. And I'm glad to be on the call today.
Thank you so much. So just so folks have a little bit of a layout for what the call is going to look like, we're going to start by talking a little bit about what is intersectionality and what is anti-oppression work. Then after just like a brief amount of time there, wish we could spend more, but we have to keep it moving. We're going to talk about why is intersectionality important generally, and also why is it important specifically to the pro-democracy movement. And then finally, we're going to end with some specific tools that Move to Amend, Free Speech for People has created about how to actually have the amendment movement become more intersectional. Tools that will give us ways to think about what we can do moving forward to create an inclusive movement. So before we do that, though, I'm going to pass it over to Caitlin, who's actually going to open it up for a question for the audience.
Hey everybody, I actually forgot to introduce myself when I first started speaking. So I'm Caitlin, suppose you found that. I'm National Director of Move to Amend. So we just wanted to hear, why did you join the call? What are you hoping to get from it? And you can go ahead and actually type that answer in the chat bar so that everyone can see each other's answers. And we won't be able to read everybody's, but we will read some. We have about 72 people here right now, not counting the presenters. So can't read everyone's, but if you type in why are you here and what you're hoping to get out of this, we'd love to get some of your answers. Let's see. So Ginny says that they hope that it would apply to the organizing that they're doing. Susan says she's working with, a local branch of the American Promise on the 28th Amendment and is always looking for more organizing tools. Looks like Matt, I'm not seeing the rest of the name, but I'm guessing it's Matt. We cannot overcome corporate oppression without overcoming race relations and equality. Agree with that. Mark is interested in learning about coalition building for separation of church and state issues. Barbara is looking to find better ways to build coalition in segregated rural Florida. Layla's here because this is a lot of what her Move to Amend affiliate does and talks about. Leslie's here to learn about Move to Amend, supported by the Pachamama Alliance, and she's moderating their Game Changer Intensive course in Nevada. Mark is looking to maybe start a Move to Amend affiliate in Michigan. And Lynn says, how do we get the legislation for heart and soul community services with a good basic guaranteed income with single payer for all of us? Maybe we'll do just a couple more. Tara's here to deepen her understanding and capacity around intersectionality and open her eyes to things that she wouldn't otherwise see to bring this work into Move to Amend. And Cindy says, I lead a pro-democracy organization in Washington State, and the 28th Amendment, campaign finance, voting access, etc., to help attain real democracy. We'll never have true democracy without everyone represented. We want to make sure that our work includes everyone. All right, and there's still some answers coming in. So thanks to all of you for your answers and for being here. Turn it back over to Jasmine.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. So it's like a range of people who are interested in incorporating it to work and also just their personal individual lives. So that's like really exciting to hear and something that we're really happy about, especially with 74 participants on. So I'm very happy that you all are here. So just to start, I'm going to give an overview on intersectionality, and Jessica's going to go more into some terms that we use when we think about anti-oppression work. So critical race theorist Kimberly Crenshaw actually coined the term intersectionality to refer to overlapping or intersectional social identities such as race, class, gender, and then the related systems of oppression that go with those identities: racism, sexism, heteronormativity, etc. So the idea is that people who live with multiple intersecting social identities tend to experience multiple systems of oppression. So their perspectives and their experiences are going to be very different from people with fewer subordinated intersecting identities. So I'll give my own self as a personal example. I'm queer and I'm Puerto Rican. I'm a woman and I have a lot of student debt. I grew up low income. So my perspective is going to be likely very different from somebody who doesn't have those identities. And that's because I've had to deal with in my life things like racism, homophobia, classism, sexism. But I don't have to deal with some other layers of oppression, such as things around physical ability or discrimination based on religion, like Islamophobia or anti-Semitism. It's just, it's also important to recognize that every person should take time to stop and think about their identity and think about their own complexities, because we all have a lot of complexities within it. So moving forward, just to give a more clear understanding of intersectionality, I want to just share my screen really quickly so that I can share a YouTube video. And I'm just going to play a minute of the YouTube video. And it just goes in a little bit more depth as to what intersectionality is. So just check in with the co-hosts. Can you all see my screen? Perfect.
Today we hear a call for full equality for women and distinctly for women of color from a multiplicity of perspectives. Intersectionality is a term we often hear, but what does it mean? Kimberly Crenshaw, who coined the term in 1989, explains it with a metaphor.
Consider an intersection made up of many roads. The roads are the structures of race, gender identity, class, sexuality, disability. And the traffic running through those roads are the practices and policies that discriminate against people. Now, if an accident happens, it can be caused by cars traveling from any number of directions, and sometimes from all of them. So if a Black woman is harmed because she is in an intersection, her injury could result from discrimination from any or all directions.
Intersectionality in all discussions of the rights of African American women today is built on the work of previous generations who have always been a part of the fight for full equality.
All right, so that's just to give a little bit more context for folks about the term of intersectionality. So I'm going to give it over to Jessica now, who's going to discuss some of the terms that we use when we talk about systems of oppression.
Thanks, Jasmine.
Okay, so before we dig in, we just want to go over a few very basic definitions that you might hear on this call, so that we're starting with some shared language which relate to the systemic oppression and intersectionality we're talking about. We can offer further definitions and explanation of terms in the follow-up that we'll send you after this webinar, because this is by no means exhaustive, nor am I an expert. So the first term here is systemic oppression. And that refers to systems that unjustly keep communities in hardship, inequity, and harm, and are perpetuated by laws, policies, and systems. Similarly, racism refers to discrimination plus power with regards to race. And that's what makes racism different than discrimination, is the power part of that. This combination leads to a perpetuation of racial inequality and further disenfranchisement for those people without systemic power. Many of these laws that protect racism and systemic oppression are strengthened by corporate power and money in politics. So Move to Amend has a 30-minute documentary, if you're curious about how these are codified. It's called Legalized Democracy, and it's free to stream on YouTube. I'd highly recommend checking that out. We'll also include that in the follow-up email. The next term is heteronormativity. It's a big one, relating to a worldview that promotes heterosexuality as a normal or preferred sexual orientation and punishes those who do not fit into that expectation. The term cis or cisgender, a term that is used to describe individuals who, for the most part, identify as the gender they were assigned at birth by their doctor and by society. The word trans or transgender is an umbrella term used to refer to those whose personal identity and gender is different than what was assigned to them at birth. So for Western English-centric people, we often describe these individuals as trans, transgender, non-binary, or gender non-conforming. It's important to also understand that cultures around the world historically have their own languages in describing the diverse understanding of gender identity and gender roles. Transphobia is oppressing, discriminating against people for being trans or non-binary. Cisnormativity, the assumption that all or almost all individuals are cisgender. At best, cisnormativity contributes to the erasure of trans or non-binary experiences, and at worst, it is part of a deliberate and calculated system of oppression that institutionalizes sexism and transphobia and promotes violence against those people. So there are so many more terms and nuances to these terms presented here, and we'll include some resources for you in the follow-up email so you can read more about these. But we'll end there for today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. So I'm actually going to pass it over to Jonathan because I want Jonathan to explain a little bit about why you think it's important to bring in an intersectional and anti-oppression framework to the work that we all do. And I know you touched a little bit about this in your introduction, but I know that there was a quote from Audrey Lorde and then just other conversations around that as well. So, thank you.
Thank you. And let me see if I can make this share screen thing work too. Let's see. Okay. Do y'all see anything different? Okay, let's see. There we go. Can y'all see that? Perfect. Oh no, that's not what I wanted. That's what I want. Okay, so, and I'm gonna move this. Listen to this quote, and you can see it so you can also follow along if you like, and save it so you can go and read it later and share it with other people. Audrey Lorde says, I am a lesbian woman of color whose children eat regularly because I work in a university. If their full bellies make me fail to recognize my commonality with a woman of color whose children do not eat because she cannot find work, or who has no children because her insides are rotted from home abortions and sterilization, if I fail to recognize the lesbian who chooses not to have children, the woman who remains closeted because her homophobic community is her only life support, the woman who chooses silence instead of another death, the woman who is terrified lest my anger trigger terrified who chooses silence instead of death, the woman who is terrified lest my anger trigger the explosion of hers. If I fail to recognize them as other faces of myself, then I am contributing not only to each of their oppressions, but also to my own. And the anger which stands between us then must be used for clarity and mutual empowerment, not for evasion by guilt or for further separation. I am not free while any woman is unfree, even when her shackles are very different from my own. And I am not free as long as one person of color remains chained, nor is any one of you. And I think this quote is so important because it really lifts up this reality that many of us have chains. And oftentimes in the struggle, it is quite difficult to distinguish what makes your chains different from my chains and whose chains are more important than somebody else's chains. And the reality is there is so much more in common that we have than there are differences. And that's why intersectionality is so important, because it lifts up the idea that there are multiple groups and people who come from different experiences of oppression, and that indeed, if we can just figure out how to bond together, if we can figure out how to share one another's stories, because that is what intersectionality is. It is stories and experiences of struggles and triumph that we must lift up, and we must share what makes us bonded and what makes us strong. And so why is this work important? It's important because, one, it helps us break abusive systems, which the reality is we are a part of. When we can shed light on various struggles that are before us, we can then heal. We can then empower ourselves to dismantle these systems that oppress us. And likewise, it's important because it forges a spirit of community justice, this insight from the oppressed that is necessary. Think about it. If the oppressors try to dismantle or even address oppression without hearing the stories and the experiences and the perspectives of the oppressed, oppression will not end, because it's impossible for the oppressed to know exactly what the oppressed is experiencing. So it's very, very critical that we incorporate those perspectives. And that's what we talk about at the Charles Hamilton Houston Institute. We talk about why it's important for us to raise these voices in the community. That's the model that we have at the Institute, because we believe that the community possesses the knowledge and the wisdom and the experience necessary to give us the keys and the tools to unlock this oppression and dismantle these types of systems. The reality is marginalized people are more powerful than the oppressor makes them seem. That is the reality. That is the reason why the oppressor keeps them oppressed, because they are indeed more powerful than we give marginalized people credit. And so let me pause for a moment. And if you are on this call, and if you are watching this webinar in the future somehow, and you are somehow a marginalized person, I want to extend love and power to you today, and remind you that you are significant and that you are needed, and that your voice is indeed valuable and important in this work. And if you are somehow one of those people who are not marginalized, thank you for watching this. Thank you for being a part of this. Thank you for being in what I think is the next critical aspect of intersectionality work. Thank you for being in solidarity with us. Thank you for building this effort with us. It is so critical. Solidarity is not just sympathy. It's not that I feel you. I feel bad for you. I'm somehow moved. I don't need you to be moved. I need you to get up, and I need you to work. I need you to understand my experience and do everything that you can to help dismantle my oppression. You are here on this call today to do just that, and we are grateful. Now let's get to work. So therefore, solidarity then requires us to do more than learn. We have to act. We have to learn to act, not learn to learn. Not learn to just know, not learn to just be aware. Our learning must be guided by a morality mandate and a political spirituality that causes us to be prompted to dismantle oppressive systems and reimagine our cultural values.
Thank you. Thank you. So that's a great overview, great discussion as to just in general, why these issues are so important, why intersectionality, anti-oppression framework, working towards this work is so valuable. But also I want to get a little bit more into detail as why it's important specifically to the amendment movement. And I think this lays really good foundational work for us to then move into a discussion as to what tools we have that can allow us to actually start building these intersectional movements. And so with this, I'm going to bring in other panelists to explore this sort of topic. So we're going to have some panelists that are going to give us some history and also current knowledge on how systems of oppression in the United States operate and how they've been operating. Then Jessica and I are going to talk about how people who experience these systems of oppression are hit even harder by the impacts of money in politics, corporate rights, corporate dominance, and political inequality today. So we're going to start with Rael. Rael's going to give us a 5-minute discussion related to economic inequality in the United States.
Thank you. Thank you, Jasmine. So my name is Rael OMalley. Again, I'm representing United for a Fair Economy here in Boston. So much like what we heard from many of the reasons that bring you all here, we believe that in order to have a fair economy, that we must address inequalities of race, gender, sexual orientation, nationality, and class, and other aspects of our identity. The story of economic inequality in the U.S. involves a long history of policies of white supremacy, policies of patriarchy, policies of oppression. So I'm going to share just a little bit with you all about how my own story illustrates some of that. And first, I'm just going to highlight some of the consequences of having policies that are designed to hurt communities of color, that are designed to hurt women, that are designed to hurt working people and benefit the corporate elite. So many of you might be familiar, but it's shocking nonetheless that the top 1/10 of 1% in the United States has as much wealth, nearly as much wealth as the bottom 90%. So, and this is a reality that is simultaneous to the fact that Black families on average have 10 cents for every dollar of wealth held by white families. Latinx families or Latina families have 12 cents for every dollar of wealth held by white families. And I'm going to share one more with you, which is that women make up 3/4 of the low-wage workforce, and women of color make up 37% of the low-wage workforce. So this is the reality of the economy, and there are certainly many more aspects that we will be going into. But this demonstrates how the power elites have taken control of democracy and devised ways of amassing huge sums of wealth. And this has happened throughout U.S. history. That it's full of examples of how wealth has been extracted from communities of color and built on the exploitation of the labor of women, particularly women of color and immigrant women. So just a few examples from my own story. So I was raised in Minnesota. My ancestors were immigrants from Sweden and Ireland and Western Europe. And just a couple of generations after immigrating to this country, my Irish and Swedish ancestors moved to the Midwest to take advantage of what was called the Homestead Act. And the Homestead Act was a series of policies that started in 1862 and lasted there were versions up until the 1980s that distributed 10% of the overall land of the United States into the hands of citizen heads of households, so the vast majority white men. So it was through this policy that my ancestors received 160 acres of land for free from the federal government. And this was land from which Native peoples had been violently displaced. So there's a historian, there's a historian named George Lipsitz who says that some 46 million adults can trace the core of their family's wealth and assets back to the Homestead Act. So that's roughly 1/4 of white adults in the US who can trace their assets in some way back to this policy of displacement, of wealth extraction. So fast forwarding a few generations in my family lineage, we can see how the ownership of wealth and assets is navigated on highly unequal terms. So my own grandmother was raised middle class, but became downwardly mobile when her father decided not to grant her any inheritance, but instead to divvy it up between her two brothers. So yet another example of how patriarchy is embedded into both policies and practices throughout US history. And there's unfortunately just no shortage of examples of how women of color in particular have been blocked from wealth building. One very critical example is how the New Deal, which laid a foundation for today's middle class, deliberately excluded agricultural and domestic workers, which was a decision that had devastating impacts to African Americans, particularly African American women. So if we look at the history of the United States economy and we trace where the origins of economic inequality come from, it shows us that our attempts to build a movement for economic inequality must be intersectional in its approach. So I really appreciate the conversation so far, and I'm looking forward to more perspective and analysis from our participants. And again, thanks so much.
Thank you so much for that history and that background. And of course, there's many more examples that show how, like you've mentioned, how we've benefited certain communities and excluded other communities from having access to economic opportunity. And that's still happening to this day. So I'm going to turn it back over to Jonathan Allen. And Jonathan is going to talk a little bit about the history of political inequality in the United States and how that's always existed for certain oppressed communities, including communities of color, queer and trans communities, etc.
Thank you, Jasmine. And I think this is really important. And before I say more, I like to start by saying this, because certainly since Donald Trump was elected, we as a country have just uproared in disdain and shock, like we are new to this. But we are not new to this. For indeed, our democracy is under siege, but it is not because Donald Trump is president. Our democracy has been under siege. Matter of fact, the reason why Donald Trump is president is because our democracy is already under siege, and has been under siege for quite some time. Matter of fact, we probably could form an argument that says, do we really have a democracy? But that's another question for another day. Let me say this. If we be reminded of our history, we know that this country was founded with slavery. And after slaves were emancipated and freed to some degree, some were not, but those that were, those people then face laws, vagrancy laws, that told them that you could not be homeless. And if you were homeless, you would be arrested. The same people that were just in slavery picking cotton were the people that were now on streets that were being arrested for not having money to buy homes. Okay. And their slave masters were the ones that went back and purchased them and paid their fines and brought them back onto their plantations. History goes on, and we know that we had laws that said that Black folk were not even a full person. So at one point we wasn't even considered people. We were 3/5 of one. And then there were redlining in Detroit, for example, is a place where we saw that Black communities were placed in a specific area and marginalized. And this is the case all around the country. The 15th Amendment, we know that when it was passed, did not include women, and therefore certainly did not include women of color. And so even as we were seemingly trying to make progress, as we say, we still see that injustice has always been there. White primaries existed, where people of color could not vote. They could not be a part of the primary system unless they were white. That was eventually outlawed. But there are arguments today that where we see that there are a such thing now as wealth primaries, where if you do not have a certain amount of wealth, you can't even participate in certain primaries. And those primaries are often the ones that determine who the individual will be elected for that particular district, or even the president of the United States. There are primaries that have a significant bearing on who will be elected as president of the United States. In addition, voting rights. You know, we know that there are ID laws. Voter suppression is real. Even Section 5 of Voting Rights Act, it has been challenged and has been ripped away from us. Those things are really important, and those were the safeguards that helped us to hold responsible and accountable those states and in areas of our country where indeed we had the most exacerbated form of voter oppression. And that has been ripped away. And so that makes us ask the question, have we really come far enough? Are we really making the progress that we claim to be making, as we continue to see that not only has injustice stemmed way back since our inception, but injustice is alive, and it is strong, and it is moving even today. And even today, we have, for the first time, not the first time, but certainly, for the first time, we have the most incarcerated people of color than we have had in our history, and it is a problem. Our young people are in jail. Our men of color are in jail in large numbers. Our women of color are in jail, and they're not in jail because they're wrong. They're not in jail because they're harming anybody. They're not all in jail because they are a detriment or a threat to society. Indeed, and in large part, many of them are in jail, if not, and oftentimes the issue isn't that they're just in jail, but how long are they been sentenced compared to someone else for an offense that arguably is worse than marijuana. And those exacerbated sentences are of true concern, ones that we should be thinking about and ones that we should be educating people about. Mass incarceration is real. When someone is in prison, they then experience collateral sanctions. Those collateral sanctions then bar them from voting when they get out. They have no more access to Pell Grants to be able to go to college like everyone else. And many people who are incarcerated come from marginalized communities. They don't come from families where they have a lot of money, so they can't just get out and go and pay the tuition. And so those things are critical. They are important, and we must be addressing them, and we must be talking about them as is. Injustice is real, and I think the way that we begin to address this, we have to get close to the people who are most affected by these injustices.
Thank you, Jonathan. So we're going to go over to Mason, who's going to talk a little bit about how money in politics and corporate rights affects the trans community and the queer community.
Sure. Thank you so much. And I want to say thank you to everybody who's spoken so far. I'm sitting here just kind of like listening and absorbing and really enjoying the conversation. So thank you. First, I want to tie in a concept and a discussion and term that was mentioned a little earlier and oftentimes comes up in these conversations around intersectionality, which is the issue and impact of colonization. And more specifically, how colonization has impacted trans, gender nonconforming, and non-binary identities in our world. Oftentimes when I do a lot of education around trans inclusion and inclusivity and practices, I get this comment of like, trans identities are so new. These are things that, only young people are trans or non-binary, or that it exists somehow only for young people. And that is inherently false. Trans people have been around since time immemorial. We simply, due to Western colonization, some of the cultures where trans identities were openly discussed, our identities, our history has been erased. And so I think it's really important to name that, particularly thinking about communities, Native communities, First Nations, as well as some of the Southeast Asian communities that have openly celebrated trans and non-binary people for centuries. And we just, because of Western colonization, we don't have those conversations. And that means that we as trans people don't have our history recognized until what now people are saying is so new. It's only new to Western society in many ways. So wanted to make that note. I want to just now briefly pull this into, Jasmine, your comment about the impact of political inequality and corporate personhood, and what that means for trans folks in particular. I, of course, I would not do this topic justice if I didn't recognize the intersections of oppression that trans people, particularly trans people of color, particularly trans feminine people of color face in our world. Living at that intersection of transphobia as well as racism and sexism is a deadly intersection, and our community is under siege, particularly at that intersection, and so we have to recognize that. And I especially need to recognize that as a white trans masculine person, my own privilege within the trans community. It's important and essential for me to recognize that and lift that up, that my privilege as a white trans masculine person, as a white blending trans masculine person, I should say, also is really important. Moving into the topic here. So the political inequality, and I was actually thinking about this at great length this morning. And the fact is that political inequality in the trans community is deeply tied to the erasure of trans and gender nonconforming identities in our world. The voter ID laws, I'm going to pull that out as an example of this. If a trans person lives in a state where it is impossible or near impossible to update our name or gender marker on our ID, on any form of ID, the chances of us then being able to vote or having access to vote is eliminated, because we are being asked to present an identity document that does not reflect our identities, that opens us up for oppression, opens us up for violence and discrimination at the polling place. It simply means that we are less likely to vote and to engage and have that right. And so I think that's really important to recognize. And so name and gender marker change stuff is really important, and unfortunately creates symptoms of inequality across the board in healthcare, in politics, in economic endeavors, etc. Not all states have restrictive laws or policies for changing your name or gender marker, but many of them do. Either you are able to change your name or gender marker, or you can if you can afford which can at times be astronomical costs to make it inachievable to change your name and gender marker on legal identity documents. And so that's really important to address. In terms of what we are seeing with issues of corporate personhood and the fact that corporations are now seen to have these First Amendment rights, which includes the freedom of religion, what that has created is an inequality where trans folks are employed by a corporation that, for instance, Hobby Lobby, we'll just use that as a random example pulled out of a hat. Where a corporation says that I have a First Amendment right to deny aspects of healthcare, a lot of time that conversation has been focused on reproductive justice, which is essential and important, and I'm not saying that it's not. But what we don't often see is the conversation of what that means for trans folks and our access to transition-related healthcare. For those in the trans community who do need to access medical elements of transition. And please note that not all trans people medically transition. Put a little asterisk in there, and I can talk about that later if we'd like. But for those trans people who is essential to medically transition, if they are working for a corporation or business who says, I don't want to provide healthcare coverage for something that I think is a violation of my faith, a violation of my religion, or my personal beliefs in whether or not you deserve life-saving care, suddenly now trans people are asked to pay out of pocket for what can be tens of thousands of dollars for medically necessary care. This is not cosmetic care. This is medically necessary care that is being denied to trans people because corporations say that we are a violation of their faith. And that kind of discrimination is claiming lives. And it's creating a real issue for many trans people in various sectors across the country and internationally, of course. So those are just a few topics of the importance of raising up trans identities and trans rights when we are talking about political process, political activism. I do also just want to say I'm very excited to see trans candidates running for office. This is new in terms of, in the last 10 years, actually seeing trans people run for and achieve a political office while being openly trans. And that is amazing and wonderful, but it is also such a small number. And I am hoping to see more trans candidates run, but we can't have trans candidates run where there is such economic inequality faced by the trans community. Expecting a trans person to raise thousands of dollars in order to run for office is unfortunately impossible, just because it takes thousands of dollars sometimes for us just to survive and access identity documents, healthcare, and beyond. So that's me rambling a little bit, but I hope that was helpful.
Yes, very helpful. Thank you so much, Mason. So just kind of tying in a lot of these things, we heard the panelists explain how various communities have and still are being prevented from having equal access to both our political and our economic systems, as well as sometimes to just basic human rights services. So in addition, because of the also 4 decades, more than 4 decades, of Supreme Court decisions around corporate rights and political spending, lack of access to economic opportunity means even more barriers for folks of color to access our political systems, and not just folks of color, but other people who have been marginalized and have been prevented from having access to economic opportunity. So just like Mason was talking about, Demos has actually issued a couple of reports that are just how big money systems perpetuate both economic inequality and racial bias in our society. And one of the issues that we see is that it's harder for people of color to run as candidates. It's harder for queer and trans folks to run as candidates. And when those folks do run, they're less likely to raise the money that they need to raise. And they're also less likely to win. Demos also has talked about and showed recent research that has demonstrated that rich individuals have policy preferences that are different from the general public, and that the government is more sharply responsive to the policy preferences of the wealthy few than those of the average voter. So this helps sustain massive economic inequality that exists today, despite the fact that the vast majority of the general population does actually want to shift economic policies. So I just actually want to show really quickly again, screen share, and just show this little document here. So here is from one of the reports that Demos issued. You can see some of the preferences for the wealthy for policy around economic justice and for the general population. And you can see that there are some pretty stark differences for how the percentage of people from the general population want to enact certain legislation versus the wealthy few. And a lot of these are things that we see have not been enacted in many states and around the country today. So even though the vast majority of people care about some of these policy issues, we're not seeing any shifts. And this is something that I think people are really attuned to. People have an understanding of this already. 75% of people, when polled, say that the wealthy few have more of a say in politics than anyone else. And we have data that backs this up now. So it's just kind of reinforcing what we've already known. And also, again, kind of the same sort of conversation that because of our nation's past and present exclusion of people of color and other groups from accessing our economic systems, there's less of an ability to have money to compete with corporations and the wealthy in trying to promote policies that you care about. So, you know, again, Demos with their racial bias studies talk about how there's been a record corporate political spending on election campaigns, and that has amplified the political exclusion of people of color. So instead of getting better because of the systems of money and politics combined with the layers of oppression that have always existed and continue existing, we're actually getting worse off in that we're less likely to be able to hear the concerns of people of color. And the policy outcomes that have been resulting from that big money campaign finance system, they fail to address the needs of people of color, and oftentimes, in some cases, actively restrict progress on racial equity. So we're not only making the exclusion of people's color voices heard, but as a result, the policy shows that in a lot of cases, we're also additionally restricting progress on racial equality in the United States and racial equity for certain. So I'm going to just bounce it over to Jessica to just kind of tie it back to the amendment, tie up any loose ends, and then we're going to go into how we can get more intersectional, the tools that we have available now.
Thanks, Jasmine. Very well said. So we know that all people, and really all living things, feel the effects of corporate rule. However, we can begin to see through this generous insight today that those who do not hold institutional power and political power, and those whose voices are historically silenced, feel the effects of corporate rule most harshly. So those who are already disenfranchised by the effects of corporate capitalism are those who need to be heard most when we work to address these problems. And we cannot possibly have a full discussion about personhood, political power, and democracy without addressing the ways in which people are systematically harmed by the current system. And these systems are particularly harmful for, of course, Native people, Black people, people of color, queer and trans people, and other communities who have been excluded from economic and political opportunity in the past. And if we don't address this, we will absolutely fail as a movement. That's my opinion, and I think that's shared widely here. Looking at many spaces and organizations in the Get Many Out of Politics and amendment movement, there's a lot of resistance to talking about this because it's not easy, but I think that we're not here for easy. Otherwise, we wouldn't be trying to amend the Constitution. We're here for liberation, really. So we study history also, and we know that the most successful movements in history to expand democracy have been multiracial, multi-ethnic, cross-class, and intersectional. And we can also see from history the ways that movements were splintered in the past by not addressing these issues. So not only is it the right thing to do to have this conversation, but it's also strategic. We need a broad, deep people's movement in order to make revolutionary change that we're trying to make here. And so it's increasingly important in the democracy movement and the movement to amend the Constitution that if we're going to have a chance to do this, that we do it right, and that we learn from the past. And so thank you so much for the perspective shared here and the really tangible examples of how that manifests in our movement. I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much. So before we move on to the tools, I just want to give a couple minutes and maybe shift it over to Caitlin. If there's any questions that have popped up for our panelists, specific questions, so not just like comments or general observations, but questions related to anything that the panelists said, because some of the panelists cannot stay for the whole webinar. So we want to give individuals an opportunity to kind of ask these questions of the individuals who just spoke before, and we'll open up for questions again towards the end of the webinar.
Thanks. Yeah, it looks like there's only one, although if folks have questions, hurry up and type them in. But it's a bit of a comment, but it's actually one that comes up a lot, so I think saying it makes sense. So Michael says, using the term intersectionality, don't all issues, racism, environmental, electoral, gender, guns, neoliberal, economic policies, healthcare, education, and privatization, trade, and on, in some way systemically converge around capitalism and its natural tendency to marginalize and divide populations in order to grow power and maintain the status quo? So Thus, the corporate power and personhood is the root barrier to creating democracy and to the people's right to create communities centered on fairness, justice, and equality. Therefore, all disenfranchised groups and diverse issues must cut to the root, to the problem at the root. So there's no question mark in there, but I'm going to say that this comes up a lot, and I think that it would be helpful if maybe folks could speak to why it doesn't make sense to ask people to stop working for other aspects of their liberation and instead come and work on corporate power, but rather to actually do that in a way that connects the issues, but doesn't ask anybody to stop working on the frontline work they're already doing. Does anybody want to take that?
I think I'll say in short that these are people's lives that we're talking about. People are living real lives and having real struggles. And while that might be ideal, that we all just stop doing everything and attack corporate personhood, the reality is when someone is trying to feed their family and when Black men and Black girls are being shot in streets, it's kind of hard to negotiate which one is more important. While corporate personhood is important to address, also saving my life and being safe is very, very important as well. And so for folk who are marginalized, the amount of challenges that are against them are great, and they're almost equal. In many, many ways. And so it's hard to prioritize. That's why we need all hands on deck. That's why we need all people involved, all of us engaged in doing this work. And that's why we also need white folk to be at the forefront. That's why we need that. That's very important. And I will also say that's why we also cannot forget our youth. We cannot forget our students. Our student leaders are powerful. They have voices that are incredible. And so we must engage them as well, because they can help us address some of these issues as they are growing, as they are evolving in a way that I don't think we're prepared and equipped to do. So we must do that. We must empower our young people as well. I hope that helps and answers to some degree. I know others will have answers and responses that'll be helpful too.
There aren't any other questions, so if there's anybody else who wants to add on to Jonathan's excellent response, there was time, otherwise we can move on.
Yeah, I'll just jump in, and Jonathan, thank you for that analysis, because I share it as well. The reality of where our communities are at in terms of the threat to our lives and our day-to-day ability to just exist in what relative safety and wellness is very real. And so, I spend time doing, the work around political and economic inequality and moving towards equality, but that doesn't mean I can't drop the work that I do for insurance advocacy to ensure that trans folks have access to the necessary health care. And I think so it has to be kind of a both and, that we recognize and work for many movements. That also leads to a lot of burnout in our community of activism and advocacy. So I got to name that, because every day I meet folks who are burning out because they're trying to do everything, because we're asked to do everything, as well as deal with our own identities and being a person, being a trans person, or being a person of color, or any other marginalized identity, as well as doing work around marginalized identities, is exhausting. And so we want to do it all. We try our best. We don't always get it right, and it's okay when we make mistakes. We own them and we move on and we learn from them. But asking us to do all the things all the time, or dropping the things we need to in order to survive on a day-to-day or keep our communities thriving, or pushing towards thriving, it's a lot. And we can't ignore the day-to-day for a 30,000-foot view of the work that needs to be done.
Maybe I can just add one quick thing too, because I sort of, and Michael clarified that that wasn't exactly what they were saying, and I understand that. But it is a question that comes up a lot, and I bet you some people out there had this question, you know, of like, this is the systemic issue, let's do this. But I think this is also part of why when we are talking about the systemic solutions and corporate power, that that we not sort of try and make that as like simple in especially if we're folks who are coming from privilege as possible, and sort of leave out all the rest of the story. And therefore then the only folks who can see themselves in the story of having relevance around corporate power or fighting for democracy are then, you know, not all of these marginalized folks. I think that our movement, our Money in Politics, Money Out of Politics movement does a pretty bad job of this most of the time. So we need to do better, and to tell the story as one that is the more relevant story that we're hearing today, which lots of times white folks say, oh, you know, that makes it about race, and then we're going to alienate other white people, and like, okay, but we'll also make space for tons of other people. So prioritizing the comfort of other white people over the experience of marginalized folks gets us smaller numbers, to go back to Jessica's strategic point.
And I wanted to say one additional thing to that, Michael, and thank you for that clarity. And to that point, I think our divided front, the reality that we're not bound together in a united way to address these issues, it is because that's a byproduct of systemic racism. It pins us against each other. It makes us fight and prioritize our oppression and our struggles, and that is indeed the problem. So you're exactly right. We should be binding together. But the challenge is that there are so many people who are oppressed that don't even realize that they are oppressed.
It looks like there's no other questions at this time, Jasmine.
All right, cool. So again, if anybody has questions, feel free at any point to submit them. We're going to have another Q&A session at the end. Not all of our panelists will likely be on the call. You might see some of them drop over the next chunk of time, and that's okay. But we'll just continue moving forward so that we could talk about how to actually get this intersectional movement and the tools that some of us have. And so just so you know, we're going to be talking about how to educate people. So the fact that we need to educate ourselves and other activists who intend to work with communities that deal with systemic oppression, what types of events we can be doing, events that center people from marginalized communities to bring in new audiences and to help us grow in learning and our perspective, and also how we can build with other individuals, build solidarity with other individuals collectively. So we're going to start. I'm going to pass it over to George from Move to Amend, who's going to talk a bit about the Movement Education Program, which is a program that was created to provide this education for activists working in this area.
Thanks, Jasmine. Wow, this has been quite a call. Thank you all. It's sobering. That's a good word for it. And I want to really have some time to talk about why it's important to address all of the issues that have been shared. A couple of things before I share. That is that there's not a hierarchy of oppression. There's a way that sometimes folks might think that, you know, this is more important than that and try to prioritize. Intersectionality helps us understand that there is a web of powerlessness, policies, and practices that make it difficult for many of us to access a uncluttered route to justice and freedom. That's the nicest way I can say it. Okay, so when it comes to Move to Amend and why we pay attention to these issues, it's at its root because we want to win. If we are to change the fundamental law of the land of the United States, the Constitution, we have to have a movement. That movement can't just be comfortable, middle-class, cisgendered white people. I mean, maybe, but no, that's not happening. A movement has to be broad and deep. To build a movement, you have to be able to understand and include the experiences, the genius, the strategies, and the passion of everybody. Sorry, it's late in the afternoon. That means white. Okay, here's the deal. When you think about people, who are you thinking about? When most folks say people, they're thinking about white people. White people who have food in the refrigerator, all the bills are paid, and there's something in the savings account. Someone went to college, you might have a PhD, you probably go to church, and you're cisgendered. So if you're gonna build power with folks who are on the edge, and y'all have heard stories all afternoon during this call of what it means to be on the edge, how are you gonna do that unless you have some skills? At the Movement Education Program, we help folks to build the skills so that we can build power enough to change the Constitution successfully. It also means we learn lessons, and Jessica and Jasmine mentioned earlier, learning lessons from past movements, labor movements, civil rights movements, the abolitionist movement, the women's rights movement, the queer justice movement. There's a lot of lessons to learn. So one of the other fundamental things I like to think about when we think about this work, one of the fundamental lessons is there is no hierarchy of oppression. So if you get stuck there, take a breath and work on your own issues. Something's up. Okay. The other one that's really important and fundamental, I think, in this work is that it is the rest of your life. So give yourself and each other a break. But you have to do the work. There are no shortcuts. If someone knew how to do it by now, we wouldn't be here. So it's 2018, we've got work to do the work. It doesn't mean you have to be guilty or feel shame or blame. It means you have to do the work. You have to be strategic. You have to have a plan and follow it. So one of the great things in the Movement Education Program, and Jessica's going to tell you a little bit in about 90 seconds about the Movement Education Program, is that we have thought through how are we reflecting some of what our culture has taught us in our organization? And how do we dismantle that so that we're effective? What plan do we have to be in solidarity with the communities that we have to build power with? How are we measuring our effectiveness there so that we're moving forward? We're not stuck. And that's consistent hard work, which you should celebrate and recognize, but stay on track. I might have to fill in something else, so I'm here, Jessica, if you need me, but I'm going to turn it to you now. Thanks.
Thanks, George. That was great. So the Movement Education Program is a curriculum that we've developed at Move to Amend over the years. There have been several renditions of it based on need for new information and new perspectives. It's a 5-session curriculum in its current state that addresses issues of oppression and how they are recreated sometimes in our activist spaces and movement spaces. Because certainly, I think all of us can attest to the fact that these networks of oppression and these dynamics don't go away when we step into movement organizing spaces. They're still there. And so much of the work that we do is about building trust and solidarity. And there's no way really to build those things unless we're understanding these dynamics and how they're manifesting. And we're being really explicit about resisting them and building structures that are built for justice. So the Movement Education Program is required for all Move to Amend staff, board, interns, volunteers, affiliate members. Everyone goes through this together because it's a learning process for everybody. And we talk about the ways that racism, cis heteropatriarchy, all of these things show up in our spaces. And at the end, after we've gone through all of these resources and study, we also come out with concrete products. So each group who goes through this process together comes out with both an internal democracy agreement. So how are we going to take what we've just learned and apply it to our group in an intentional way, and make agreements about how we're going to operate together with these things in mind. They also come out with a solidarity organizing plan. So identifying who in your community has power, who in your community doesn't have power, and how you could act in solidarity being a verb, with some of these groups. So it's based on lessons that we've learned as an organization internally, navigating the movement. It comes from lessons from past social justice movements, as George was mentioning, labor movement, abolitionists, queer liberation, etc. So there's this section, which is a curriculum for us to study these dynamics. We also have an online curriculum, which will be rolling out soon, which is an in-depth study of some of these past movements. So really deep dive into the labor movement. What are the lessons to be learned from there? And a variety of other movements that have lessons to teach us about these things. So we spend a lot of time learning, building this curriculum and improving it. And if you go to movetoamend.org/education, you can see its current iteration, always evolving and trying to be better. There's lots of resources there. And if you're interested in applying that to your group, whether you're a Move to Amend affiliate or anybody else, we would really love to help you utilize these resources. They're free, they're for everybody, and we're learning with you. So I think I'll pause there. Thank you, Caitlin just chatted the link to the Movement Education Program page. So I'll invite you all to go through that with us, and more to come on the online version later on.
Thank you so much. So I want to jump into a little bit of the work I do specifically with Free Speech for People. So first, pull back. Why is it important to create events that center people from marginalized communities? So I think it's important for a couple different reasons. For one, it's going to strengthen our movement because it's going to bring in more people with valuable and unique perspectives who are often unheard in our political systems. And we want to make sure that we're inclusive and bringing in those folks, because oftentimes they will think of solutions that we might not have ever thought of before. Which kind of relates to the next point, which is these types of events that center people from marginalized communities can often broaden the conversation on money and politics to a conversation that goes well beyond the discussion of campaign contributions and how much money is spent in a campaign, to a conversation about the concentrations of wealth and power in our country and how that intersects with other systems of oppression. And so I just kind of want to talk a little bit that typically money and politics events, getting big money out of politics events, promoting corporate rights, events around the 28th Amendment can oftentimes feel disconnected from people's everyday lives. And we talked about this earlier on the call. These events can oftentimes focus on concerns like the increasing amount of money spent in elections or of court cases or what donors and companies are benefiting from these systems. But oftentimes they might fail to recognize how big money system hurts people who have been marginalized by systemic oppression. And so when we center individuals from grassroots organizations who are already working in these communities, they can broaden the conversation and connect issues of money and politics and corporate rights to more pressing or directly affecting issues that their community has a vested interest in addressing. So individuals who are experiencing systemic oppression, as people have been talking about on this call, often have a lot of issues that are impacting their day-to-day lives and a lot of things that are at the forefront of their mind. So in an effort to help provide some sort of a framework, I just want to say that I wrote a framework with as Free Speech for People with and co-released it with Demos. And the framework is on centering marginalized communities. And so it's a guide that I've created for creating these intersectional money and politics events. But before we get into it, I want to talk a little bit about giving tips for coalition building. Finding community partners to work with isn't easy work. It requires a lot of different things like gaining trust, being held accountable, sharing knowledge and sharing control, also self-awareness. And we want to make sure that when we're doing coalition building, that we're hearing voices and expressions of others as it comes, and holding space for that. So just a little bit on each of these: self-awareness and personal education. We talked a bit about this with the movement education program and the value, but it's really important to understand a little bit when you're coming into working with communities who've been marginalized by systemic oppression, of understanding a little bit of your own privilege, your own oppression, your own identity, and bringing that with you, and a good heart, open heart with you. Also gaining trust. It's really important to be involved. You want to make sure when you're looking for coalition partners that you're involved in the community that you're reaching out to. Go to events and meetings that are hosted by other organizations that are trusted in the community, and listen to those meetings, listen to what people are saying, their concerns are, and wait for organizers to come to you before you address all of these things that you want other people to be doing. I've learned this rule in organizing called the trust model. And with that, you double the amount of time that you're supposed to spend on a project just to build trust. So for example, if you are working on a 6-month project, you're going to want to make it a year-long project. And that first 6 months should be only about building trust in the community. And that's just so that you don't run into things like asking organizations to support your cause without really understanding what their concerns are and without finding ways to support them. And it's going to just help you get trust from the community, and be more involved with really formulating shared solutions and shared knowledge. And so I wanted to go talk a little bit also about willingness to be held accountable. People, when doing this work, are probably going to make mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. That's okay. Just kind of find ways to think about processes so that you can take in feedback and learn from it and grow from it. And just know that even if you make mistakes, you should continue moving forward, and that we're going to all be making mistakes together and learning from each other together, which goes to shared control and knowledge. Be flexible in what you want to collaborate with. Find ways to share your insight, any thoughts that you have on money and politics, corporate personhood, corporate rights, political equality, but also listen to how others are feeling, especially how others view issues that affect their access to political equality, which even today on this call, we heard different ways that political equality brings up thoughts for other communities. And so just going through the framework, I want to again kind of share the screen to talk, to show you all a bit about the framework itself. So hold on. So here's the framework right here, centering marginalized communities. And we start the framework, and I just kind of want to go through it a little bit. Not spend too much time on it because I know that we are getting close to our time where everyone is going to leave. But one of the things that we start with is intersectional organizing and who's on your panel. So you just want to make sure that you're being as inclusive as you can from the beginning. Kind of the same context of it's not just about how many actors are people of color, but also are people of color directing. It's the same sort of concept. When you're doing these sorts of events, it's not just how many people of color, people from marginalized communities we have on the panel, but how many of those folks are also organizing the event, because they'll bring different insight for the questions to ask, community members to invite, how to advertise, etc. And it's incredibly helpful to have that. Also, just when organizing these sorts of events, it's important to understand that power dynamics aren't going to disappear in these events. Even if people all come with open hearts and really want to do learning, oftentimes you're going to run into some issues. And so just kind of thinking of how we can create safe spaces and make sure that we minimize the harm that gets done within these sorts of spaces. Earlier, I talked a bit about how we need to gain trust with community. I know a lot of folks on the call are probably thinking things like, oh, but I don't have another 6 months to gain that trust. Well, one, it is important to think that there's a long-term game here. It's not just a short-term game. There's not really going to be magic words that are said that instantly people are now, on your side and working with you in collaboration. That's unlikely to happen, and that's unlikely to happen at any sort of rapid speed. But when we're talking about doing a specific event to try and come into a community and learn about a community and work with a community, if you don't have that insight already, a good thing you can do is think about how to get a consultant that works within the community. So there's tons of grassroots organizers who are constantly doing this work already within any community that you're trying to reach. And how can you reach out to those grassroots organizers so that they can give you some insights for how to navigate the community groups, the organizations, how to understand what the community feels about it, about each of the different groups, and about issues within, the community, and also just understanding any interpersonal or political history between groups, because sometimes that can be really important to knowing before you walk into spaces, just so that you can be thoughtful about your interactions. So community consultant obviously should probably be paid. I know, again, all of us don't have access to bringing money to communities, but we really need to find ways to make sure that individuals within the spaces are paid for their work and their labor, especially because there's so much that they're often dealing with. The framework continues to go down and talk about logistics. It asks some really key questions when you're thinking about organizing, where you're thinking about organizing, when, key questions to consider for what communities that you're trying to bring in. And the same with advertising. Who are you trying to reach, and what are some key things to consider when trying to reach those communities? Again, to payment, I'm just recognizing that when we're working with grassroots organizations, they are working with a million other issues. Money in politics community, or getting big money out of politics and amendment-related organizations might just be focused more on these specific issues, but other communities that are dealing with oppression generally are going to have a lot more on their plates with a very short budget. People working on racial equity are oftentimes not paid very well, if anything at all. And so it's important that we recognize that we're asking like a pretty decent amount of labor from people, and that we should value that so that we can make sure that we're promoting the equity that we're trying to bring. Also, the framework talks a little bit about art, how to incorporate art into events, why it's important, and it goes into a little bit more depth, panelists and co-sponsors, how to access and find the right panelists, some information about questions and information for what to consider with that. And then even after we have all the discussion, it goes ahead and gives an actual sample schedule of a community panel on money and politics. And so this would be a panel that would center somebody from marginalized communities or a specific community group. And this could be just a sample of what that event can look like, including the introduction, some sample questions, how you can incorporate art. I even have incorporated in here the general theory behind money and politics and corporate rights, as well as real life impacts for those theories and legal theory. So there's a lot of content within this. It's really important for folks to get a grasp of, and you can find it on our website. I'll also post it on here, and we're going to be sending an email afterwards as well with information from all of the co-sponsors that you saw today, contact information, how to get involved with them, how you can learn more about the resources that they have to offer, and we'll make sure to include the framework here. Also, by the end of this weekend, I will have a web page up on Free Speech for People that's only going to be about how to make the money in politics community more intersectional. So all of the information that we have learned from this panel today will be on that web page that you can then access, as well as we're going to continue to just update it and put more information, including projects that I've worked on in the past, like how money in politics affects immigration policies and how the queer and trans community is impacted by money in politics and corporate rights. So I'll just go ahead and pass it off to Jessica to finish up, and Caitlin, if there's anybody who has any questions. But other than that, we're just going to have some time for the questions, and I think that'll be the end.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. So as has been said, coalition building is such an important component to intersectional movement building and anti-oppression work. One of the tools that we're using at Move to Amend is creating something called a movement council. So since there are so many areas of work that relate to resisting corporate rule, it's important that the different fronts of struggle are communicating and acting in solidarity with each other when possible. So we could talk for a lot of hours about solidarity, which we do in the movement education program. But one way that Move to Amend is doing this is by putting together this advisory board of folks from different fronts of struggle, different organizations all over the country who work to stay informed and in solidarity and find opportunities to support each other in the work that we're doing and to stay informed about what's going on in the wider movement. So as has been said, there are so many things going on at any given time that it's important to know what the larger movement is doing and how we can learn about their struggles and act accordingly. So I just wanted to plug the Movement Council, which we're forming now, and it's a very exciting coalition building project. Let's see. So with all that being said, I just want to thank everybody so much for panelists for lending your insight and experiences, really good and concrete examples, and I think really helps to solidify some of these concepts that can get trapped in intellectual spaces. But I think that this is a really good way to bring it down to earth and give us some concrete ways that we can use this in our daily work and also in our personal analysis and development. So Jasmine, thank you so much. You're incredible. You've put together so much really great work, and I've been lucky enough to be on this queer and trans panel. Also, it's all just so good and so important. So thank you for all of that, and thank you so much for all the panelists for joining us and lending us your time and energy. And thank you all for being here and listening so attentive.
We do have one question. And I did put out a last call for any questions, so really quick if there are any others. But one person did ask George you to clarify and say more about your statement that there is no hierarchy of oppression. Can you explain what that means?
Absolutely. One of the things that's important in working with folks is being able to have authentic relationships with them. There are a lot of negative things we learn from our culture, which is rooted in patriarchy and heterosexism and all the other things. But one of the things that happens is that we tend to say, well, that person's poor, but that person's disabled and not Christian, so they're worse off than this person. And instead of us spending our time focusing on how do we build authentic relationships and power with each other, we have this almost clearly not healthy, but almost competitive back and forth. So around the time that the concept of intersectionality was being clarified, a feminist writer, Patrice something Collins, I will remember it, Hill Collins, I think that's it, Patrice Hill Collins, you could probably look this person up online, talked about the matrix domination, which means that those who want to maintain power, who use all of these differences to divide us, also benefit by the connection of these different oppressions that creates a web almost of domination that pushes us down and becomes hard for us to untangle. So I think it was 87, maybe 89 when this was explored. Of course, my college days. And that's what is rooted in the concept that there's no hierarchy of oppression. It also helps us understand when I'm looking eye to eye to you, I'll value what you share as your life experience without trying to one-up you. And I expect you to do the same. I hope that's helpful.
Thanks, George. That is the only question I saw. So I think we can close, and also we're at time. But this has been recorded, although I started it slightly late, so we missed a couple of the introductions because I didn't realize it didn't happen automatically. But we'll send the recording along with all the other things that Jasmine has said that we will send ASAP. And you could join us on Thursday too. There's still spots if you would like to come back.
Yes, so also what I was going to highlight is that we have another webinar on Thursday, so definitely invite other folks that you know that might be interested, but not just that, give us feedback if we should do anything different, better for the next webinar coming up, and if you all give us feedback, if you all want more of this information, and what aspects you want more of. So just let us know. I think that there is a form that can be filled out after the webinar. Is that the case, Caitlin?
Yeah, I think people will automatically be taken to it, but I also just posted the link so folks can just click that before you click out of here, and we'd love your feedback.
Yes, so thank you all so much for joining this call. I know it was long and a lot of information, a lot of content, but we're very happy that you were here.
Thanks, everybody. Good night. Thanks, Jasmine.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.